Disc 4.
Hoskins left obediently and returned a moment or two later with Sergeant Cottrell, a brisk young man with a good opinion of himself, who always managed to annoy his superior officer. Inspector Bland much preferred the rural wisdom of Hoskins to the smart know-all attitude of Frank Cottrell. "Still searching the grounds, sir," said Cottrell. "The lady hasn't passed out through the gate. We're quite sure of that. It's the second gardener who's there, giving out the tickets and taking the admission money. He'll swear she hasn't left." "There are other ways of leaving than by the main gate, I suppose?"
"Oh, yes, sir. There's the path down to the ferry, but the old boy down there, 𝗏𝘗𝗰𝗵𝗲𝘁 his name is also quite positive that she hasn't left that way. He's about 100, but pretty reliable, I think. He described quite clearly how the foreign gentleman arrived in his launch and asked the way to Nasse House. The old man told him he must go up the road to the gate and pay for his admission. But he said the gentleman seemed to know nothing about the fete and said he was a relation of the family. So the old man set him on the path up from the ferry through the woods. 𝗏𝘗𝗰𝗵𝗲𝘁 seems to have been hanging about the quay all the afternoon, so he'd be pretty sure to have seen her ladyship if she'd come that way. Then there's the top gate that leads over the fields to 𝗏𝑑own Park, but that's been wired up because of trespassers. So she didn't go through there. Seems as though she must be still here, doesn't it?"
That may be so," said the inspector. "But there's nothing to prevent her, is there, from slipping under a fence and going off across country? Now, Sir George is still complaining of trespassing here from the hostel next door, I understand. If you can get in the way the trespassers get in, you can get out the same way, I suppose."
"Oh, yes, sir, indubitably, sir. But I've talked to her maid, sir. She's wearing—"
Cottrell consulted a paper in his hand. "A dress of cyclamen crepe gorget, whatever that is, a large black hat, black court shoes with 4-inch French heels. Not the sort of things you'd wear for a cross-country run. She didn't change her clothes?"
"Oh, no, I went into that with the maid. There's nothing missing, nothing whatever. She didn't pack a suitcase or anything of that kind. She didn't even change her shoes. Every pair's there and accounted for."
Inspector Bland frowned. Unpleasant possibilities were rising in his mind. He said curtly, "Get me that secretary woman again. Bruce, or whatever her name is." Miss Brewis came in looking rather more ruffled than usual, and a little out of breath.
"Yes, Inspector," she said. "You wanted me? If it isn't urgent, Sir George is in a terrible state, and—"
"What's he in a state about?"
"He's only just realized that Lady Stubbs is, well, really missing. I told him she'd probably only gone for a walk in the woods or something, but he's got it into his head that something's happened to her. It's quite absurd."
"Well, it might not be so absurd, Miss Brewis. After all, we've had one murder here this afternoon."
"Well, you surely don't think that Lady Stubbs—" "Oh, but that's ridiculous. Lady Stubbs can look after herself, can't she? Of course she can. She's a grown woman, isn't she?"
"But rather a helpless one, by all accounts."
"Nonsense," said Miss Brewis. "It suits Lady Stubbs now and then to play the helpless nitwit if she doesn't want to do anything. It takes her husband in, I dare say, but it doesn't take me in."
"You don't like her very much, Miss Brewis." Bland sounded gently interested. Miss Brewis's lips closed in a thin line.
"It's not my business either to like or dislike her," she said.
The door burst open, and Sir George came in.
"Look here," he said violently. "You've got to do something. Where's Hattie? You've got to find Hattie. And what the hell's going on around here, I don't know. This confounded fate, some ruddy homicidal maniac's got in here, paying his half-crown, looking like everyone else, spending his afternoon going around murdering people. That's what it looks like to me."
"I don't think we need take such an exaggerated view as that, Sir George."
"Yeah, well, it's all very well for you sitting there behind the table, writing things down. What I want is my wife."
"Well, I'm having the ground searched, Sir George."
"Well, why did nobody tell me she'd disappeared? She's been missing a couple of hours now, it seems. I thought it was odd that she didn't turn up to judge the children's fancy dress stuff, but nobody told me she'd really gone."
"But nobody knew," said the inspector.
"Well, someone ought to have known. Someone ought to have noticed."
He turned on Miss Brewis.
"You ought to have known, Amanda. You were keeping an eye on things."
"Well, I can't be everywhere,"
said Miss Brewis. She sounded suddenly almost tearful.
"I've got so much to see to.
If Lady Stubbs chose to wander away—" "Wander away? Why should she wander away? She had no reason to wander away unless she wanted to avoid that Dago fellow."
Bland seized his opportunity. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. "Did your wife receive a letter from Mr. de Sousa some 3 weeks ago telling her he was coming to this country?" Sir George looked astonished.
"No, of course she didn't."
"You're sure of that?"
"Oh, quite sure. Hattie would have told me. Why, she was thoroughly startled and upset when she got his letter this morning. It more or less knocked her out. She was lying down most of the morning with a headache."
"Well, what did she say to you privately about her cousin's visit? Why did she dread seeing him so much?" Sir George looked rather embarrassed.
"Well, blest if I really know," he said. "She just kept saying that he was wicked."
"Wicked? In what way?"
"Well, she wasn't very articulate about it. She went on rather like a child, saying that he was a wicked man, bad, and that she wished he wasn't coming here. She said he had done bad things."
"Done bad things? When?"
"Oh, long ago. Well, I should imagine this Etienne de Sousa was the black sheep of the family, and that Hattie picked up odds and ends about him during her childhood without understanding them very well, and as a result she'd got a sort of horror of him. Well, I thought it was just a childish hangover myself. My wife is rather childish sometimes, has likes and dislikes, but can't explain them."
"Are you sure that she did not particularize in any way, Sir George?" Sir George looked uneasy.
"Well, I wouldn't want you to go by what she said."
"Oh, then she did say something?"
"Well, all right. I'll let you have it. Well, what she said was, and she said it several times, he kills people."
Chapter 10. "He kills people?" Inspector Bland repeated.
"Well, I don't think you ought to take it too seriously," said Sir George. "She kept repeating it and saying, 'He kills people.' But she couldn't tell me who he killed, or when, or why. Well, I thought myself it was just some queer childlike memory, trouble with the natives, something like that."
"You say she couldn't tell you anything definite. Do you mean couldn't, Sir George? Or might it have been wouldn't?"
"I don't think—"
He broke off.
"I don't know. Well, you've muddled me. Well, as I say, I didn't take any of it seriously. I thought perhaps this cousin had teased her a bit when she was a kid, something of that kind. It's difficult to explain to you, because you don't know my wife. I'm devoted to her, but half the time I don't listen to what she says, because it just doesn't make sense. Anyway, this de Sousa fellow couldn't have had anything to do with all this. Now, don't tell me he lands here off a yacht and goes straight away through the woods, kills a wretched girl guide in a boathouse. Why should he?"
"Oh, I'm not suggesting that anything like that happened," said Inspector Bland. "But you must realize, Sir George, that in looking for the murderer of Marlene Tucker, the field is a more restricted one than one might think at first."
"Restricted?" Sir George stared. "You've got a whole ruddy fate to choose from, haven't you? 200 or 300 people? Any one of them might have done it."
Yes, I thought so at first. But from what I've learnt now, that's hardly so. The boathouse door has a Yale lock. Nobody could come in from outside without a key."
"Well, there were 3 keys.
"Oh, exactly. One key was the final clue in this murder hunt. It's still concealed in the hydrangea walk at the very top of the garden. The second key was in the possession of Mrs. Oliver, the organizer of the murder hunt. Where is the third key, Sir George?"
"Oh, it ought to be in the drawer of that desk where you're sitting." No, the right-hand one with a lot of the other estate duplicates."
He came over and rummaged in the drawer.
"Yes, here it is, all right."
"Then you see," said Inspector Bland, "what that means. The only people who could have got into the boathouse were first the person who had completed the murder hunt and found the key, which, as far as we know, did not happen. Second, Mrs. Oliver, or some member of the household to whom she may have lent her key. And third, someone whom Marlene herself admitted to the room."
"Well, that latter point covers pretty well everyone, doesn't it?"
"Oh, very far from it," said Inspector Bland. "If I understand the arrangement of this murder hunt correctly, when the girl heard anyone approaching the door, she was to lie down and enact the part of the victim and wait to be discovered by the person who had found the last clue, the key. Therefore, as you must see for yourself, the only people whom she would have admitted, had they called to her from outside and asked her to do so, were the people who had actually arranged the murder hunt. Any inmate, that is, of this house. That is to say, yourself, Lady Stubbs, Miss Brewis, Mrs. Oliver, possibly Monsieur Poirot, whom I believe she had met this morning. Who else, Sir George?" Sir George considered for a moment or two.
"Oh, well, the Legges, of course," he said. "Alec and Sally Legge. Well, they've been in it from the start. And Michael Weyman, well, he's an architect staying here in the house to design a tennis pavilion. Or Warburton. And the Mastertons. Oh, and Mrs. Folliat, of course."
"And that is all? Nobody else?"
"That's the lot."
"So you see, Sir George, it is not a very wide field." Sir George's face went scarlet.
"I think you're talking nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Are you suggesting that... What are you suggesting?"
"I'm only suggesting," said Inspector Bland, "that there's a great deal we don't know as yet. It's possible, for instance, that Marlene, for some reason, came out of the boathouse. She may even have been strangled somewhere else and her body brought back and arranged on the floor. But even if so, whoever arranged her was again someone who was thoroughly cognizant with all the details of the murder hunt. We always come back to that." He added in a slightly changed voice, "I can assure you, Sir George, that we're doing all we can to find Lady Stubbs. In the meantime, I'd like to have a word with Mr. and Mrs. Alec Legge, and Mr. Michael Weyman."
"Amanda?"
"Well, I'll see what I can do about it, Inspector," said Miss Brewis. "I expect Mrs. Legge is still telling fortunes in the tent. A lot of people have come in with the half-price admission since 5 o'clock, and all the side shows are busy. I can probably get hold of Mr. Legge or Mr. Weyman for you, whichever you want to see first." "Oh, it doesn't matter in what order I see them," said Inspector Bland. Miss Brewis nodded and left the room. Sir George followed her, his voice rising plaintively.
"Now, look here, Amanda, you've got to..."
Inspector Bland realized that Sir George depended a great deal upon the efficient Miss Brewis. Indeed, at this moment, Bland found the master of the house rather like a small boy. Whilst waiting, Inspector Bland picked up the telephone and demanded to be put through to the police station at Helmouth, and made certain arrangements with them concerning the yacht Espérance. "You realize, I suppose," he said to Hoskins, who was obviously quite incapable of realizing anything of the sort, "that there's just one perfectly possible place where this damn woman might be, and that's on board de Sousa's yacht?"
"Well, how do you make that out, sir?"
"Well, the woman has not been seen to leave by any of the usual exits. She's togged up in a way that makes it unlikely that she's legging it through the fields or woods, but it is just possible that she met de Sousa by appointment down at the boathouse, and that he took her by launch to the yacht, returning to the Fleet afterwards."
"Well, and why would he do that, sir?"
demanded Hoskins, puzzled. "I've no idea," said the inspector, "and it's very unlikely that he did. But it's a possibility. And if she is on the Espérance, I'll see to it she won't get off there without being observed."
"But if her fare ain't at this side of then?"
Hoskins dropped into the vernacular. "All we know is that she said she did." "Women," said the inspector sententiously, "tell a lot of lies. Always remember that, Hoskins."
"Ah,"
said Constable Hoskins, appreciatively. Further conversation was brought to an end as the door opened and a tall, vague-looking young man entered. He was wearing a neat grey flannel suit, but his shirt collar was crumpled and his tie askew, and his hair stood up on end in an unruly fashion. "Are Mr. Alec Legge?" said the inspector, looking up. "No," said the young man. "I'm Michael Weyman. You asked for me, I understand."
"Oh, quite true, sir," said Inspector Bland. "Won't you take a chair?"
He indicated a chair at the opposite side of the table.
"No, well, I don't care for sitting," said Michael Weyman. "I like to stride about."
What are all you police doing here anyway? What's happened?"
Inspector Bland looked at him in surprise. "Oh, didn't Sir George inform you, sir?" he asked.
"Nobody's informed me, as you put it, of anything. I don't sit in Sir George's pocket all the time. What has happened?"
"Well, you're staying in the house, I understand."
"Of course I'm staying in the house. What's that got to do with it?"
"Simply that I imagine that all the people staying in the house would by now have been informed of this afternoon's tragedy."
"Tragedy? What tragedy?"
"The girl who was playing the part of the murder victim has been killed."
"No!"
Michael Weyman seemed exuberantly surprised.
"Do you mean really killed? No fakery-pokery?"
"Well, I don't know what you mean by fakery-pokery. The girl's dead."
"Well, how was she killed?"
"Strangled with a piece of cord." Michael Weyman gave a whistle.
"Exactly as in the scenario. Well, well, that does give one ideas."
He strode over to the window, turned rapidly about, and said,
"So we're all under suspicion, are we? Or was it one of the local boys?"
"Well, we don't see how it could possibly have been one of the, local boys, as you put it," said the inspector.
"Well, no more do I, really," said Michael Weyman.
"Well, Inspector, many of my friends call me crazy, but I'm not that kind of crazy. I don't roam around the countryside strangling underdeveloped, spotty young women." "Oh, you're down here, I understand, Mr. Weyman, designing a tennis pavilion for Sir George?"
"A blameless occupation," said Michael.
"Oh, criminally speaking, that is."
"Architecturally, I'm not so sure. The finished product will probably represent a crime against good taste, but that doesn't interest you, Inspector."
"What does interest you?" "Well, I should like to know, Mr. Weyman, exactly where you were between 4:15 this afternoon and, say, 5 o'clock.
"Oh, how do you tape it down to that? Medical evidence?"
"Not entirely, sir. A witness saw the girl alive at 4:15.
What witness?
Or mayn't I ask?" "Miss Brewis. Lady Stubbs asked her to take down a tray of creamy cakes with some fruit aid to the girl."
"Our Hattie asked her that? I don't believe it for a moment."
"Well, why don't you believe it, Mr. Weyman?"
"Well, it's not like her. Well, not the sort of thing she'd think of or bother about. Dear Lady Stubbs's mind revolves entirely around herself."
"Well, I'm still waiting, Mr. Weyman, for your answer to my question."
"Ah, yes, well, where I was between 4:15 and 5 o'clock? Well, really, Inspector, I can't say offhand. I was about, if you know what I mean."
"About where?"
"Well, here and there. I mingled a bit on the lawn, watched the locals amusing themselves, had a word or two with the fluttery film star, and then, when I got sick of it all, I went along to the tennis court and mused over the design for the pavilion. I also wondered how soon someone would identify the photograph that was the first clue for the murder hunt with a section of tennis net."
"Did someone identify it?"
"Yes, I believe someone did come along, but I wasn't really noticing by then. I got a new idea about the pavilion, a way of making the best of two worlds. My own and Sir George's."
"And after that?"
"After that? Well, I strolled around and came back to the house. I strolled down to the quay and had a crack with old Myrtle, then came back. I can't fix any of the times with any accuracy. I was, as I said in the first place, about. That's all there is to it."
"Well, Mr. Weyman," said the inspector briskly, "I expect we can get some confirmation of all this."
"Well, Myrtle can tell you that I talked to him on the quay. But of course that'll be rather later than the time you're interested in. Must have been after 5 when I got down there. It's very unsatisfactory, isn't it, Inspector?"
"Oh, well, we shall be able to narrow it down, I expect, Mr. Weyman."
The inspector's tone was pleasant, but there was a steely ring in it that did not escape the young architect's notice. He sat down on the arm of the chair.
"Seriously," he said, "who can have wanted to murder that girl?" "You've no ideas yourself, Mr. Weyman?"
"Well, Offhand, I'd say it was our prolific authoress, the Purple Peril. Have you seen her imperial purple get-up? I suggest that she went a bit off her onion, and thought how much better the murder hunt would be if there was a real body. How's that? Is that a serious suggestion, Mr. Weyman? Well, that's the only probability I can think of. Well, there's one other thing I would like to ask you, Mr. Weyman. Did you see Lady Stubbs during the course of the afternoon? Of course I saw her. Who could miss her? Dressed up like a mannequin of Jacques Fath or Christian Dior. When did you see her last? Last? I don't know. Well, striking an attitude on the lawn about 3:30, or 4:15, perhaps. And you didn't see her after that? No, why? I wondered, because after 4 o'clock nobody seems to have seen her. Lady Stubbs has vanished, Mr. Weyman. Vanished? Our Hattie? Oh, that surprises you? Yes, it does rather. What's she up to, I wonder? Do you know Lady Stubbs well, Mr. Weyman? Well, I never met her till I came down here 4 or 5 days ago. Have you formed any opinions about her? I should say she knows which side her bread is buttered better than most, said Michael Weyman dryly. A very ornamental young woman, and knows how to make the most of it. But mentally not very active, is that right? Well, it depends what you mean by mentally, said Michael Weyman. I wouldn't describe her as an intellectual, but if you're thinking that she's not all there, you're wrong. A tone of bitterness came into his voice. I'd say she was very much all there. Nobody more so. The inspector's eyebrows rose. Well, that's not the generally accepted opinion. Yes, well, for some reason she likes playing the dim nitwit. I don't know why, but as I said before, in my opinion, she's very much all there. The inspector studied him for a moment, and then he said, And you really can't get any nearer to exact times and places between the hours I've mentioned? Sorry, Weyman spoke jerkily. I'm afraid I can't. Rotten memory, never any good about time, he added. Finished with me? As the inspector nodded, he left the room quickly. And I'd like to know, said the inspector, half to himself and half to Hoskins, what there's been between him and her ladyship. Either he's made a pass at her and she's turned him down, or there's been some kind of a dust-up. He went on. What would you say was the general opinion round these parts about Sir George and his lady? She's daft, said Constable Hoskins. Well, I know you think that, Hoskins, but is that the accepted view? I'd say so. And Sir George, is he liked? Oh, he's liked well enough. He's a good sportsman. He knows a bit about farming. The old lady's done a lot to help. What old lady? Mrs. Folliat, who lives at the lodge here. Oh, of course. The Folliats used to own this place, didn't they? Yes, and it's owing to the old lady that Sir George and Lady Stubbs have taken up as well as they have. Got 'em in with the knobs everywhere, she has. And paid for doing so, do you think? Oh, no, not Mrs. Folliat. Hoskins sounded shocked. I understand she knew Lady Stubbs before she was married, and it was she who urged on Sir George to buy this place. I'll have to talk to Mrs. Folliat, said the inspector. Well, she's a shrewd old lady, she is. If anything's going on, she'd know about it. I must talk to her, said the inspector. I wonder where she is now. Chapter 11. Mrs. Folliat was at that moment being talked to by Hercule Poirot in the big drawing-room. He had found her there, leaning back in a chair in a corner of the room. She had started nervously when he came in. Then, sinking back, she had murmured, "Oh, it's you, Monsieur Poirot." "Oh, I apologize, madame. I disturbed you." "Oh, no, you don't disturb me. I'm just resting. That's all. I'm not as young as I was." The shock. It was too much for me. "I comprehend," said Poirot. "Indeed, I comprehend." Mrs. Folliat, a handkerchief clutched in her small hand, was staring up at the ceiling. She said in a voice half stifled with emotion, "I can hardly bear to think of it. That poor girl. That poor girl." "I know," said Poirot. "I know. "But so young," said Mrs. Folliat. "Just at the beginning of life." She said again, "I can hardly bear to think of it." Poirot looked at her curiously. She seemed, he thought, to have aged by about 10 years since the time, early in the afternoon, when he had seen her, the gracious hostess welcoming her guests. Now her face seemed drawn and haggard, with the lines in it clearly marked. "You said to me only yesterday, madame, it is a very wicked world." "Did I say that? Oh." Mrs. Folliat seemed startled. "Well, it's true. Oh, yes, I'm only just beginning to know how true it is." She added in a low voice, "But I never thought anything like this would happen." Again he looked at her curiously. "Well, what did you think would happen then? Something?" "Oh, no, I didn't mean that." Poirot persisted. "But you did expect something to happen? Something out of the usual, eh?" "No, you misunderstand me, Monsieur Poirot. I only mean that it's the last thing you would expect to happen in the middle of a fete like this." "Lady Stubbs this morning also spoke of wickedness." "Hattie did?" "Oh, well, don't speak of her to me. Don't speak of her. I don't want to think about her." She was silent for a moment or two, and then said, "What did she say about wickedness?" "Well, she was speaking of her cousin, Etienne de Sousa. She said that he was wicked, that he was a bad man. She said, too, that she was afraid of him." He watched, but she merely shook her head incredulously. "Etienne de Sousa? Well, who's he?" "Oh, of course, you were not at breakfast. Oh, I forgot. Mrs. Folliat. Lady Stubbs received a letter from this cousin of hers, whom she had not seen since she was a girl of 15. He told her that he proposed to call upon her today, this afternoon." "And did he come?" "Oh, yes, he arrived here about 4:30. "Well, surely, do you mean that rather handsome, dark young man who came up the ferry path? I wondered who he was at the time."
"Oh, yes, madame, that was Mr. de Sousa."
Mrs. Folliat said energetically, "Well, if I were you, I should pay no attention to the things Hattie says." She flushed as Poirot looked at her in surprise and went on. "No, she's like a child. I mean, she uses terms like a child. Wicked, good. No half shades. I shouldn't pay any attention to what she tells you about this Etienne de Sousa." Again Poirot wondered. He said slowly, "You know Lady Stubbs very well, do you not, Mrs. Folliat?" "Oh, probably as well as anyone knows her. Possibly even better than our husband really knows her. And if I do?"
"Well, what is she really like, madame?"
"Oh, what a very odd question, Monsieur Poirot."
"You know, do you not, madame, that Lady Stubbs cannot be found anywhere?"
Again her answer surprised him. She expressed no concern or astonishment. She said, "So, she has run away, has she? I see."
"Well, it seems to you quite natural, that?"
"Natural? Oh, I don't know. Hattie is rather unaccountable."
Or do you think she has run away because she has a guilty conscience?"
"What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?"
"Her cousin was talking about her this afternoon. He mentioned casually that she had always been mentally subnormal. I think you must know, madame, that people who are subnormal mentally are not always accountable for their actions."
"What are you trying to say, Monsieur Poirot?"
"Such people are, as you say, very simple, eh? Like children. In a sudden fit of rage, they might even kill."
Mrs. Folliat turned on him in sudden anger. "Hattie was never like that. I won't allow you to say such things. She was a gentle, warm-hearted girl, even if she was a little simple mentally. Hattie would never have killed anyone." She faced him, breathing hard, still indignant. Poirot wondered. He wondered very much. Breaking into this scene, P.C. Hoskins made his appearance. He said in an apologetic manner,
"I've been looking for you, ma'am."
"Oh, good evening, Hoskins." Mrs. Folliat was once more her poised self again, the mistress of Nasse House. "Yes? What is it?"
"Well, the inspector's compliments, and he'd be glad to have a word with you. Well, if you feels up to it, that is."
Hoskins hastened to add, noting, as Hercule Poirot had done, the effects of shock. "Of course I feel up to it." Mrs. Folliat rose to her feet. She followed Hoskins out of the room. Poirot, having risen politely, sat down again and stared up at the ceiling with a puzzled frown. The inspector rose when Mrs. Folliat entered, and the constable held the chair for her to sit down. "I'm sorry to worry you, Mrs. Folliat," said Bland, "but I imagine that you know all the people in the neighbourhood, and I think you may be able to help us." Mrs. Folliat smiled faintly. "I expect," she said, "that I know everyone round here as well as anyone could do. What do you want to know, Inspector?" "Well, you knew the Tuckers, the family, and the girl?" "Oh, yes, of course. They've always been tenants on the estate. Mrs. Tucker was the youngest of a large family. Her eldest brother was our head gardener. She married Alfred Tucker, who was a farm labourer, a stupid man, but very nice. Mrs. Tucker is a bit of a shrew. A good housewife, you know, and very clean in the house, but Tucker is never allowed to come in anywhere farther than the scullery with his muddy boots on. You know, all that sort of thing. She nags the children, rather. Most of them have married and gone into jobs now. There was just this poor child, Marlene, left, and 3 younger children, 2 boys and a girl still at school. Now, knowing the family as you do, Mrs. Folliat, can you think of any reason why Marlene should have been killed today?" "Well, no, indeed I can't. It's quite unbelievable. Well, if you know what I mean, Inspector. There was no boyfriend or anything of that kind, or I shouldn't think so. Well, not that I've heard of, anyway. Now, what about the people who've been taking part in this murder hunt? Can you tell me anything about them?" "Well, Mrs. Oliver I'd never met before. She's quite unlike my idea of what a crime novelist would be. She's very upset, poor dear, by what has happened, naturally." "And what about the other helpers? Captain Warburton, for instance?" "Well, I don't see any reason why he should murder Marlene Tucker, if that's what you're asking me," said Mrs. Folliat composedly. "I don't like him very much. He's what I call a foxy sort of man. But I suppose one has to be up to all the political tricks and all that kind of thing if one is a political agent. No, he's certainly energetic and has worked very hard over this fate. I don't think he could have killed the girl anyway, because he was on the lawn the whole time this afternoon." The inspector nodded. "And the Legges? What do you know about the Legges?" "Well, they seem a very nice young couple. He's inclined to be what I should call moody. I don't know very much about him. She was at Carstairs before her marriage, and I know some relations of hers very well. They took the mill cottage for 2 months, and I hope they've enjoyed their holiday here. We've all got very friendly together." "Well, she's an attractive lady, I understand." "Oh, yes, very attractive." "Would you say that at any time Sir George had felt that attraction?" Mrs. Folliat looked rather astonished. "Oh, no. I'm sure there was nothing of that kind. Sir George is really absorbed by his business and very fond of his wife. He's not at all a philandering sort of man." "And there was nothing you would say between Lady Stubbs and Mr. Legge?" Again Mrs. Folliat shook her head. "Oh, no, positively." The inspector persisted. "And there's been no trouble of any kind between Sir George and his wife that you know of?" "Well, I'm sure there hasn't," said Mrs. Folliat emphatically. "And I would know if there had been." "It wouldn't be, then, as a result of any disagreement between husband and wife that Lady Stubbs has gone away?" "Oh, no," she added lightly. "The silly girl, I understand, didn't want to meet this cousin of hers. Some childish phobia. So she's run away just like a child might do." "And that's your opinion? Nothing more than that?" "Oh, no. I expect she'll turn up again quite soon, feeling rather ashamed of herself." She added carelessly, "And what's become of this cousin, by the way? Is he still here in the house?" "Oh, I understand he's gone back to his yacht." "And that's at 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗃, is it?" "Yes, at 𝗏𝗏𝗃. "I see," said Mrs. Folliat. "Well, it's rather unfortunate, Hattie behaving so childishly. However, if he's staying on here for a day or so, we can make her see she must behave properly." It was, the inspector thought, a question, but although he noticed it, he did not answer it. "You're probably thinking," he said, "that all this is rather beside the point, but you do understand, don't you, Mrs. Folliat, that we have to range over rather a wide field?" Miss Brewis, for instance. What do you know about Miss Brewis? Well, she's an excellent secretary. Well, more than a secretary. She practically acts as a housekeeper down here. In fact, I don't know what they'd do without her. Now, was she Sir George's secretary before he married his wife? I think so. I'm not quite sure. I've only known her since she came down here with them. Now, she doesn't like Lady Stubbs very much, does she? No, said Mrs. Folliat. I'm afraid she doesn't. I don't think these good secretaries ever do care for wives much, if you know what I mean. Perhaps it's natural. Now, was it you or Lady Stubbs who asked Miss Brewis to take cakes and a fruit drink to the girl in the boathouse? Mrs. Folliat looked slightly surprised. I remember Miss Brewis collecting some cakes and things and saying she was taking them along to Marlene. I didn't know anyone had particularly asked her to do it or arranged about it. It certainly wasn't me. I see. Now, you say you were in the tea tent from 4 o'clock on. I believe Mrs. Legge was also having tea in the tent at that time. Mrs. Legge? No, I don't think so. At least I don't remember seeing her there. In fact, I'm quite sure she wasn't there. We'd had a great influx by the bus from 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏, and I remember looking around the tent and thinking that they must all be summer visitors. There was hardly a face there that I knew. I think Mrs. Legge must have come in to tea later. Oh, well, said the inspector, it doesn't matter. He added smoothly, well, I really think that's all. Thank you, Mrs. Folliat, you've been very kind. We can only hope that Lady Stubbs will return shortly. I hope so, too, said Mrs. Folliat. Very thoughtless of the dear child giving us all so much anxiety. She spoke briskly, but the animation in her voice was not very natural. I'm sure, said Mrs. Folliat, that she's quite all right. Quite all right. At that moment, the door opened, and an attractive young woman with red hair and a freckled face came in, and said, I hear you've been asking for me. Oh, this is Mrs. Legge, Inspector, said Mrs. Folliat. Sally, dear, I don't know whether you've heard about the terrible thing that has happened. Oh, yes, ghastly, isn't it? said Mrs. Legge. She uttered an exhausted sigh and sank down in the chair as Mrs. Folliat left the room. I'm terribly sorry about all this, she said. It seems really unbelievable, if you know what I mean. I'm afraid I can't help you in any way. You see, I've been telling fortunes all the afternoon, so I hadn't seen anything of what was going on. Oh, I know, Mrs. Legge, but we just have to ask everybody the same routine questions. For instance, just where were you between 4:15 and 5 o'clock? Well, I went and had tea at 4 o'clock. In the tea tent? Yes. Oh, it was very crowded, I believe. Oh, frightfully crowded. Did you see anyone you knew there? Oh, well, a few old people, yes. Nobody to speak to. Goodness, but how I wanted that tea. That was 4 o'clock, as I say. I got back to the fortune-telling tent at 4:30 and went on with my job. And goodness knows what I was promising the women in the end. Millionaire husbands, film stardom in Hollywood, heaven knows what. Mere journeys across the sea and suspicious dark women seemed too tame. Now, what happened during the half hour when you were absent? I mean, supposing people wanted to have their fortunes told. Oh, I hung a card up outside the tent. Back at 4:30. The inspector made a note in his pad. And when did you last see Lady Stubbs? Hattie? I don't really know. She was quite near at hand when I came out of the fortune-telling tent to go to tea, but I didn't speak to her. I don't remember seeing her afterwards. Somebody told me just now that she's missing. Is that true? I guess it is. Oh, well, said Sally Legge cheerfully. She's a bit queer in the top story, you know. I dare say having a murder here has frightened her. Well, thank you, Mrs. Legge. Mrs. Legge accepted the dismissal with promptitude. She went out, passing Hercule Poirot in the doorway. Looking at the ceiling, the inspector spoke. Mrs. Legge says she was in the tea tent between 4 and 4:30. Mrs. Folliat says she was helping in the tea tent from 4 o'clock on, but that Mrs. Legge was not among those present. He paused and then went on. Miss Brewis says that Lady Stubbs asked her to take a tray of cakes and fruit juice to Marlene Tucker. Michael Weyman says that it's quite impossible Lady Stubbs should have done any such thing. It would be most uncharacteristic of her. Ah, said Poirot.
The conflicting statements? Yes, one always has them.
Yeah, and what a nuisance they are to clear up, too, said the inspector. Sometimes they matter, but in 9 times out of 10 they don't. Well, we've got to do a lot of spade work, that's clear.
And what do you think now, mon cher? What are the latest ideas?
I think, said the inspector gravely, that Marlene Tucker saw something she was not meant to see. I think that it was because of what Marlene Tucker saw that she had to be killed.
Oh, I will not contradict you, said Poirot. The point is, what did she see?
She might have seen a murder, said the inspector. Or she might have seen the person who did the murder.
Murder? Said Poirot. The murder of whom?
What do you think, Poirot? Is Lady Stubbs alive or dead? Poirot took a moment or two before he replied. Then he said, I think, mon ami, that Lady Stubbs is dead. And I will tell you why I think that. It is because Mrs. Folliat thinks she is dead.
Oh, yes. Whatever she may say now or pretend to think, Mrs. Folliat believes that Hattie Stubbs is dead.
Mrs. Folliat, he added, knows a great deal that we do not. Chapter 12. Hercule Poirot came down to the breakfast table on the following morning to a depleted table. Mrs. Oliver, still suffering from the shock of yesterday's occurrence, was having her breakfast in bed. Michael Weyman had had a cup of coffee and gone out early. Only Sir George and the faithful Miss Brewis were at the breakfast table. Sir George was giving indubitable proof of his mental condition by being unable to eat any breakfast. His plate lay almost untasted before him. He pushed aside the small pile of letters which, after opening them, Miss Brewis had placed before him. He drank coffee with an air of not knowing what he was doing. He said,
Morning, Monsieur Poirot,
perfunctorily, and then relapsed into his state of preoccupation. At times a few ejaculatory murmurs came from him.
So incredible. The whole damn thing. Where can she be?
Well, the inquest will be held at the Institute on Thursday, said Miss Brewis. They rang up to tell us. Her employer looked at her as if he did not understand.
Inquest?
He said.
Oh, yes, of course.
He sounded dazed and uninterested. After another sip or two of coffee, he said,
Women are incalculable. What does she think she's doing?
Miss Brewis pursed her lips. Poirot observed, acutely enough, that she was in a state of taut, nervous tension. Hodgson's coming to see you this morning, she remarked, about the electrification of the milking sheds on the farm. And at 12 o'clock there's the... Sir George interrupted.
I can't see anyone. Put 'em all off. How the devil do you think a man can attend to a business when he's worried half out of his mind about his wife?
If you say so, Sir George. Miss Brewis gave the domestic equivalent of a barrister saying, As your lordship pleases. Her dissatisfaction was obvious.
We never know, said Sir George, what women get into their heads or what fool things they're likely to do. You agree, huh?
He shot the last question at Poirot.
Les femmes? They are incalculable,
said Poirot, raising his eyebrows and his hands with Gallic fervour. Miss Brewis blew her nose in an annoyed fashion.
Well, she seemed all right, said Sir George. Damn pleased about a new ring. Dressed herself up to enjoy the fete. All just the same as usual. Well, not as though we'd had words or a quarrel of any kind. Going off without a word.
Now, about those letters, Sir George, began Miss Brewis.
Oh, damn the bloody letters to hell,
said Sir George, and pushed aside his coffee cup. He picked up the letters by his plate and more or less threw them at her.
Answer them any way you like. I can't be bothered.
He went on more or less to himself in an injured tone.
Doesn't seem to be anything I can do. Don't even know if that police chap's any good. Very soft-spoken and all that.
Well, the police are, I believe, said Miss Brewis, very efficient. They have ample facilities for tracing the whereabouts of missing persons.
No, they take days sometimes, said Sir George, to find some miserable kid who's run off and hidden himself in a haystack.
Well, I don't think Lady Stubbs is likely to be in a haystack, Sir George.
God, if only I could do something.
repeated the unhappy husband.
"I think, you know, I'll put an advertisement in the papers. Now take it down, Amanda, will you?"
He paused a moment in thought.
"Hattie, please come home. Desperate about your George. Now, all the papers, Amanda."
Miss Brewis said acidly, "But Lady Stubbs doesn't often read the papers, Sir George. She's no interest at all in current affairs or what's going on in the world." She added rather cattily, but Sir George was not in the mood to appreciate cattiness, "Of course you could put an advertisement in Vogue. That might catch her eye." Sir George said simply,
"Well, anywhere you think, but get on with it."
He got up and walked towards the door. With his hand on the handle, he paused and came back a few steps. He spoke directly to Poirot.
"Now look here, Poirot," he said. "You don't think she's dead, do you?"
Poirot fixed his eyes on his coffee cup as he replied,
"I should say it is far too soon, Sir George, to assume anything of that kind. There is no reason as yet to entertain such an idea."
"So you do think so," said Sir George heavily.
"Well,"
he added defiantly,
"I don't. I say she's quite all right."
He nodded his head several times with increasing defiance, and went out, banging the door behind him. Poirot buttered a piece of toast thoughtfully. In cases where there was any suspicion of a wife being murdered, he always automatically suspected the husband. Similarly, with a husband's demise, he suspected the wife. But in this case he did not suspect Sir George of having done away with Lady Stubbs. From his brief observation of them, he was quite convinced that Sir George was devoted to his wife. Moreover, as far as his excellent memory served him, and it served him pretty well, Sir George had been present on the lawn the entire afternoon, until he himself had left with Mrs. Oliver to discover the body. He had been there on the lawn when they had returned with the news. No, it was not Sir George who was responsible for Hattie's death. That is, if Hattie were dead. After all, Poirot told himself there was no reason to believe so as yet. What he had just said to Sir George was true enough, but in his own mind the conviction was unalterable. The pattern, he thought, was the pattern of murder. A double murder. Miss Brewis interrupted his thoughts by speaking with almost tearful venom. "Men are such fools," she said. "Such absolute fools. They're quite shrewd in most ways, and then they go marrying entirely the wrong sort of woman." Poirot was always willing to let people talk. The more people who talked to him, and the more they said, the better. There was nearly always a grain of wheat among the chaff. "Now you think it has been an unfortunate marriage?" he demanded. "Disastrous. Quite disastrous."
"You mean they were not happy together?"
"She had a thoroughly bad influence over him in every way."
"Oh, now I find that very interesting. What kind of a bad influence?"
"Well, making him run to and fro at her beck and call, getting expensive presents out of him, far more jewels than one woman could wear, and furs. She's got 2 mink coats and a Russian ermine. Now, what could any woman want with 2 mink coats, I'd like to know?" Poirot shook his head.
"Oh, that I would not know," he said.
"Sly," continued Miss Brewis. "Deceitful. Always playing the simpleton, especially when people were here. I suppose because she thought he liked her that way."
"And did he like her that way?"
"Oh, men," said Miss Brewis, her voice trembling on the edge of hysteria. "They don't appreciate efficiency or unselfishness or loyalty, or any one of those qualities. Now, with a clever, capable wife, Sir George would have got somewhere."
"Oh, got where?" asked Poirot.
"Well, he could take a prominent part in local affairs, or stand for Parliament. He's a much more able man than poor Mr. Masterton. I don't know if you've ever heard Mr. Masterton on a platform, a most halting and uninspired speaker. He owes his position entirely to his wife. It's Mrs. Masterton who's the power behind the throne. She's got all the drive and the initiative and the political acumen." Poirot shuddered inwardly at the thought of being married to Mrs. Masterton, but he agreed quite truthfully with Miss Brewis's words.
"Oh, yes," he said. "She is all that you say. A femme formidable," he murmured to himself.
"Well, Sir George doesn't seem ambitious," went on Miss Brewis.
He seemed quite content to live here and potter about and play the country squire and just go to London occasionally to attend all his city directorships and all that. But he could make far more of himself than that with his abilities. He's really a very remarkable man, Monsieur Poirot. That woman never understood him. She just regards him as a kind of machine for tipping out fur coats and jewels and expensive clothes. If he were married to someone who really appreciated his abilities—" She broke off, her voice wavering uncertainly. Poirot looked at her with a real compassion. Miss Brewis was in love with her employer. She gave him a faithful, loyal, and passionate devotion of which he was probably quite unaware, and in which he would certainly not be interested. To Sir George, Amanda Brewis was an efficient machine who took the drudgery of daily life off his shoulders, who answered telephone calls, wrote letters, engaged servants, ordered meals, and generally made life smooth for him. Poirot doubted if he had ever once thought of her as a woman, and that, he reflected, had its dangers. Women could work themselves up. They could reach an alarming pitch of hysteria unnoticed by the oblivious male who was the object of their devotion. "A sly, scheming, clever cat. That's what she is," said Miss Brewis tearfully.
"You say is, not was, I observe," said Poirot.
"Well, of course she isn't dead," said Miss Brewis scornfully. "Gone off with a man, that's what she's done. That's her type."
"Oh, it's possible. It is always possible," said Poirot.
He took another piece of toast, inspected the marmalade pot gloomily, and looked down the table to see if there were any kind of jam. There was none, so he resigned himself to butter.
"It's the only explanation," said Miss Brewis. "Of course he wouldn't think of it."
"Has there been any trouble with men?" asked Poirot delicately.
"Oh, she's been very clever," said Miss Brewis.
"You mean you have not observed anything of the kind?"
"Well, she'd be careful that I shouldn't," said Miss Brewis.
"But you think there have been, what shall I say, surreptitious episodes, sir?"
"She's done her best to make a fool of Michael Weyman," said Miss Brewis, "taking him down to see the Camellia Gardens at this time of year, pretending she's so interested in the tennis pavilion."
"Well, after all, that is his business for being here. I understand Sir George is having it built principally to please his wife."
"But she's no good at tennis," said Miss Brewis. "She's no good at any games. She just wants an attractive setting to sit in, while other people run about and get hot. Oh, yes, she's done her best to make a fool of Michael Weyman. She'd probably have done it, too, if he hadn't had other fish to fry."
"Ah," said Poirot, helping himself to a very little marmalade, placing it on the corner of a piece of toast and taking a mouthful dubiously.
"So, he has other fish to fry, Monsieur Weyman, eh?"
"Well, it was Mrs. Legge who recommended him to Sir George," said Miss Brewis. "She knew him before she was married. Chelsea, I understand, and all that. She used to paint, you know."
"Ah, she seems very attractive and intelligent young woman,"
said Poirot tentatively.
"Oh, yes, she's very intelligent," said Miss Brewis. "She's had a university education, and I dare say could have made a career for herself if she hadn't married."
"Has she been married long?"
"About 3 years, I believe. I don't think the marriage has turned out very well."
"There is incompatibility?"
"Well, he's a queer young man, very moody. Wanders off a lot by himself, and I've heard him very bad-tempered with her sometimes."
"Ah, well," said Poirot, "the quarrels, the reconciliations, they are part of an early married life, eh? Without them it is possible that life would be drab."
"Well, she spent a good deal of time with Michael Weyman since he's been down here," said Miss Brewis. "I think he was in love with her before she married Alec Legge. I dare say it's only a flirtation on her side."
"But Mr. Legge was not pleased about it, perhaps, eh?"
"Well, one never knows with him. He's so vague. But I think he's been even moodier than usual lately."
"Did he admire Lady Stubbs, perhaps?"
"I dare say she thought he did. She thinks she only has to hold up a finger for any man to fall in love with her."
"In any case, if she has gone off with a man, as you suggest, it is not Mr. Weyman, for Mr. Weyman is still here."
"No, it's somebody she's been meeting on the sly, I've no doubt," said Miss Brewis. "She often slips out of the house on the quiet and goes off into the woods by herself. She was out the night before last, yawning and saying she was going up to bed. I caught sight of her not half an hour later, slipping out by the side door with a shawl over her head."
Poirot looked thoughtfully at the woman opposite him. He wondered if any reliance at all was to be placed in Miss Brewis's statements where Lady Stubbs was concerned, or whether it was entirely wishful thinking on her part. Mrs. Folliat, he was sure, did not share Miss Brewis's ideas, and Mrs. Folliat knew Hattie much better than Miss Brewis could do. If Lady Stubbs had run away with a lover, it would clearly suit Miss Brewis's book very well. She would be left to console the bereaved husband, and to arrange for him efficiently the details of divorce. But that did not make it true, or probable, or even likely. If Hattie Stubbs had left with a lover, she had chosen a very curious time to do so, Poirot thought. For his own part, he did not believe she had. Miss Brewis sniffed through her nose and gathered together various scattered correspondence. If Sir George really wants those advertisements put in, I suppose I'd better see about it, she said. Complete nonsense and waste of time. Oh, good morning, Mrs. Masterton, she added as the door opened with authority and Mrs. Masterton walked in.
Inquest is set for Thursday, I hear, she boomed. Morning, Monsieur Poirot.
Miss Brewis paused, her hand full of letters. Anything I can do for you, Mrs. Masterton? She asked.
No, thank you, Miss Brewis. I expect you've plenty on your hands this morning. Oh, but I do want to thank you for all the excellent work you put in yesterday. You're such a good organizer, and such a hard worker. We're all very grateful.
Oh, thank you, Mrs. Masterton.
Now, don't let me keep you. I'll sit down and have a word with Monsieur Poirot.
Enchanté, madame, said Poirot.
He had risen to his feet and bowed.
End of Disc 4.
If you enjoyed this audio and the value and effort that we bring you these audios of world-class authors, then why not buy us a cup of coffee? Look for the link below in the description area. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you will not miss another audio. Thank you for supporting this channel. It is appreciated.